What's up? This is Patrick Hayes. Welcome to my channel. I know it's been a while since I've reached out and connected with you, but I'm back and I have a really potent message to share with you guys today. Now, as you can see from the title, what I want to dig into today is inferiority, superiority, which is really kind of, can fall under the greater title of judgment. And I want to talk about it in context to polar distortions, which is a term that I coined and brought up in the last video that I made. And the reason why I'm the first polar distortion I really want to focus on, because I'm going to focus on several of them, is inferiority, superiority, or judgment, is because this polar distortion I think is almost like a meta lens that sits in the back of people's consciousnesses and binds us to the matrix or all matrices, both matrices. So both the 3D matrix, right, and then the other, you could say metaphysical matrices, right? So the New Age matrix and the religious matrix, which you could call those kind of like the second matrix. And this judgment, this inferiority, superiority, is something that is insidious, and it's operating in the background, and it's virtually unavoidable in the realm that we're existing in, in the frequency of consciousness that we're existing in. So my goal here is to give us the tools to be able to dislodge or begin to dislodge this distortion from our consciousness. Now, when I use the term polar distortion, for anybody that is not familiar with that term, go back and watch my previous video, because in my previous video I talked about polar distortions and what they are, which is there's kind of an in-depth description of it, which will really help you to integrate this video more deeply. So go check out that video if you haven't checked it out, and come back and check this one out. Now, the polar distortion of inferiority, superiority is maybe the most detrimental of all polar distortions. Maybe, I'm not sure, but it's maybe the most detrimental because of how insidious it is, and because of how prevalent it is amongst human consciousness, and that it exists in both matrices, right? So the 3D matrix, just to kind of give a little bit of a description to how to differentiate the two. The 3D matrix is primarily like a materialistic, scientific, paradigmatic lens of reality that kind of champions money, sex, and power, right? You can kind of think of it like that. Whereas the second matrix is also champions money, sex, and power, or at least distorts money, sex, and power, right? So in the New Age, money, sex, and power would be kind of retermed as like abundance, sacred sexuality, and like self-empowerment. And while there's definitely healthy interpretations of how to associate with those things, the distortion usually has to do with a justified overindulgence in these by bringing like a sacred kind of terminology and a sacred kind of framing to those different things, sex, money, and power, and then justifying it based off of what would you say, a creamed up kind of like image of them and how you're interacting with them. Whereas in the religious second matrices, more traditional religious stuff, there's usually a lot of like repression and guilt associated with those different things. So the New Age matrix creates in general, there's like an aggrandizement of self like associated with it, more of like a luciferic kind of path, an aggrandizement of self, whereas the religious matrices are more of like a disempowering kind of connotation that's given to the doctrines. So you can see they're almost like two different sides of the same coin. And so I'm starting to coin this as the second matrix, right? And so these are essentially matrices that involve metaphysical concepts and ideas, right? And involve metaphysical themes, as opposed to the 3D matrix that says God doesn't exist and it's just materialism, right? And the second matrix acts oftentimes as like a net that catches people when they break out of the materialistic matrix of the 3D world that we've been raised in and say, wait a second, there's more to this, they go into one of these other two matrices, the New Age matrix or the like fundamentalist religious matrix. Anyway, this polar distortion of inferiority superiority binds through both matrices, right? This judgment lens binds in both matrices, and that's why I think it's so important, because once we're able to kind of begin to dislodge our bind to the tendency to frame things as superior, inferior, better, worse, we actually free ourselves to be able to evolve, because it stunts the evolution process to perceive that way. And I'll go into explaining how that actually works as I move forward. So where I want to start with is the idea of paradigms, and then I'm going to build from there, right? Now, if any of you guys watch my old video called Mind Control, I talked about how paradigms are the way by which malevolent forces control humanity, right? It's not necessarily like humanity's, being controlled by like a joystick. There's like some, devious guy on the other side that's like, make a left here, make a right here. People are controlled by the programming of how they see reality. Like they're given a false map, a false paradigm, and then based off that false paradigm, they act thinking that they're acting in correspondence with reality, when really they're acting in correspondence with the distorted map. And that's essentially how consciousness is controlled by malevolent forces, right? It's more through the paradigm. They might be trying to go more for that joystick with a lot of the weird transhumanism things going on. But that's a whole different rabbit hole to go down. So I want to start with paradigms. You can think of paradigms as like a mental map. And we've all heard the saying, the map is not the territory, right? And this is monumental in being able to see clearly, is to realize that the map is not the territory. Now, the map has tremendous value to it, but we must always remember that it's not the territory. And by map, I mean our paradigmatic perspective of the world, how we think the world is, right? Now, the way that we kind of, the tools that we use to map are essentially, labels and language. That's primarily what we're using. And then, different images that we hold in our head in association with the labels and language. But again, it's important for us to realize that the map is not the territory. Now, we're all familiar with that saying, but the meaning, the potency of that understanding runs a lot deeper than I think most of us actually acknowledge. And I think that we're guilty of making the map the territory far, far, far more commonly than most of us are willing to admit. And with that being said, I also feel like there's a lot of us that are aware of the idea of universal equality and these kinds of things. And when I say equality, I don't mean it within a contextual sense. I mean equality within a universal sense. But at the same time, I feel a lot of, if you think that you've transcended the perspective of inferiority, superiority, and you're living in a totally non-dual kind of, everyone is equal kind of perspective, think again, because there's probably shadow work to be done there. Because this is a very, very difficult thing to integrate, especially in this realm that we are operating in. Because almost every single thing that we see has been cast under the light of judgment. And our entire societies, all the matrices, they've all been cast under this light of judgment, which is, inferiority and superiority, or cast under the shadow of judgment, I should say, inferiority, superiority. So let's go a little bit deeper here, and let's be prepared to maybe find some areas that we haven't been acknowledging, that maybe we're still holding certain judgments. Okay, so Paradigms, mental maps. So we have labels in language being used to map reality, right? And we're aware that the map is not the territory, at least conceptually, we're aware of that. But what is the value of maps? Well, maps bring context, right? Paradigms bring context to whatever we're experiencing. So if we had no maps, it would be very hard to orient to whatever was going on in the moment, right? So when a baby's first born, they have no map. That's why they're just kind of like, what? Like, it's just overwhelmed. What's happening? This, that. I like, you can't tell what's happening because there's no map that's built. Eventually, through pattern recognition and familiarity, you start to kind of get a sense for, okay, this on average does this thing, this on average does that thing. We call this, and that. And you can start categorizing things. And you create like a, internal mental map of the realm, and that's your paradigm. And these get extremely complex, right? Paradigms get extremely complex. But the mapping and the language and the labels helps us bring context. So if the first time we ever saw, traffic lights and cars moving through the street, we had no context, we wouldn't know how to orient whatsoever. But eventually we developed the lens and the framework to have the understanding, say, green means go, red means stop, right? But if we're mistaking the map with the territory, then what happens potentially is that when we see the green, that means go, right? And so every time we see green, we go. And then eventually what happens is we see green and we go, but we're not present enough to the reality, and how the reality will always be more intricate, and will always be there will always be novelty arising within it that can't be accounted for by the map, right? So then we go and someone ran the red light, and then we run into them because we weren't present to the reality. We were operating off the maps. Well, green means go, so I go, instead of being present to the reality and being available for when the map can't account for what's going to happen. Now, obviously, our maps are complex enough to account for the fact that people run red lights. But you get the idea of what I'm saying. The map's always going to be more complex, or the reality is always going to be more complex than the map. And this is why it's so important to realize the map is not the territory. But we still fall into making the mistake of identifying the reality as the map that we have in our head. And this is what projection is, right? When we're projecting, right? We're putting a false projection out on top of something. Now, the nature of how our mind works is projection, right? So there's not anything fundamentally wrong with projecting. We have to do that because we can't be fully present for every single intricate detail in our reality at all times to see through to the deeper nature of each thing. There's a kind of meditation where you can do that with like a blade of grass or something really small, and you can see through to like an incredible depth of these different things, far beyond the label of how we label it. But depending on what we're doing and where we're bringing our focus and what's relevant to the situation, we have to orient to particular things within a greater context. And so that which is you could say less significant in the context of what we're focusing on, we kind of let that sit as the labels while we dig deeper and make ourselves present to see what is novel and what is different in the area of focus that we're bringing our attention to. But we have to remember that the real process of showing up to life and meeting life is about using labels to orient us to the situation that we're in, but then knowing that the labels and the map is not the territory, and so letting them fall away. So we want to kind of simultaneously be completely present for anything that expresses beyond what the map can track, but at the same time be able to orient ourselves by using the map, and then eventually creating new mapping like terminologies to describe whatever novel things that arise, and then be able to map those things, right? But once we start thinking of the reality as the map, then we start getting lost, right? So it's really, or we start getting stuck, I would say. And so it's important for us to remember the map is not the territory. Now, we could say that there's two different kinds of mappings. There's probably more than this, but the two that I want to talk about, two different kinds of mappings, are discernment mapping and judgment mapping, right? Now, discernment mapping is a kind of mapping of the reality and paradigm building that is concerned with what is. Like, what is the actual reality? How do I discern what's actually happening here? Now, in order to truly discern, we have to realize that the descriptions and the labels that we're putting on things are tools. They're not the reality, but they're tools that ideally bring us closer to what is, right? So a qualitative description will bring us closer to what is. If you were mapping, say, for example, and you didn't have context for this or previous, if you're mapping like a pot that's boiling on the water on the stove, like one qualitative description that would bring you closer to what it is that you're experiencing is like heat. Okay, so there's this quality of heat, right? And so that can bring you kind of closer to what you're experiencing. It's not limited to heat, right? Heat isn't the identity of what you're looking at, but it's a qualitative description that can kind of bring you closer to what it is that you're experiencing. And then you can, add more and more of these qualitative descriptions to keep bringing you closer, knowing that none of the descriptions are the actual reality, right? And this is ultimately, discernment wants to bring us closer to what is, and it's concerned with what is. Now, the second kind of mapping that I want to talk about, and this is essentially polar distortion mapping, falls into this category, is distortive mapping, right? That doesn't bring us closer to what is, but actually limits us. And so judgment is a distortive kind of mapping. Inferiority, superiority is a distortive kind of mapping because it literally blocks us from exploring more deeply. It makes a judgment about something and puts it in its place, and then it's like a static judgment that holds it there. And it separates us from being able to meet the actual experience. Whether that's a person or an object or whatever it is, we can't meet it once we've put a judgment on it, because that judgment fundamentally separates us from being able to see what truly is underneath. So, and this is one of the things that's really important to recognize, is that while we can look at the world in a philosophical sense, all of our experience is relation. It's all relation. Relation is primary to anything, because in order for any experience to happen, besides pure beingness as oneness, is that there must be subject and object, right? There's subjective experience and object, even in terms of if it's another subject, but they have their own subjective experience, but to the other person, they're an objective other, right? There needs to be like self and other. But in order for self and other to exist, first there needs to be relationship. So everything that we're experiencing in all reality is primarily, relationship is primary. Relation is primary. And the problem with judgment is judgment blocks relation. Because once you've determined, you've made a fundamental judgment about something, you're saying this is bad or this is good, that's a black and white kind of stamp that you put on it that distorts your whole interpretation of what actually is. Because when you have a charge against something, as it's judged one way or the other, that charge of I don't like this, or I do like this, or this is bad, or this is good, or this is inferior or superior, that judgment has a charge that distorts your perspective of being able to see what is. Because the truth of the matter is, nothing is inferior or superior. Things are what they are. And that's why discernment is the mapping tool, concerned with what is, and then qualitative labels that help bring us closer to what is, as opposed to a judgment label. And I'll get deeper into this as I move forward. So the sneaky thing about the inferiority superiority mapping distortion is that it oftentimes sits as a lens that exists prior to discernment. So there's certain levels of discernment that can be used that are used after a level of inferiority superiority judgment is put on, and so it distorts the entire process of discernment. And so I'll give an example of that. See, this comes back to I guess the story of how I ended up kind of coming into this greater understanding, and this has to do with the idea of actualization. So when I was trying to figure out how to develop a map that accounted for the mystical truth of non-duality and of equality, the issue I ran into, well, I'll just give you the story. So when I started trying to figure out how to map that appropriately, and the best that I could come up with was surrounding the idea of actualization, right? So I was trying to figure out, well, what is the greatest value structure that I could place upon reality? Because you can't really map anything. It's hard to map without some sort of like value structure, because if you don't have a value structure, what chooses where you bring your attention, right? So I was thinking, well, I came to this, that all beings are equal in potential, because we all have the God spark within us. All souls have the God spark within it, and so we have equal potential. But within this sphere of physical reality, we're at different levels of actualization. In other words, some of us are more God realized than other beings, in the realm. And I still think that's I can say that's like mostly a true statement, right? I'll point out where it kind of gets a little wobbly a little later, but that there are some beings that are more God actualized than other beings. And so then my kind of mapping protocol was that, well, we're all equal in potential, but some are more actualized than others. So within this realm, there is a kind of you could say a hierarchy of actualization. And again, that's still true, but the problem with that perspective that I had wasn't that statement isn't true, but was that before that statement was a judgment of inferiority superiority that was linked to actualization and non-actualization. So in other words, I started linking less actualized as inferior and more actualized as superior. Remember, this insidious lens was sitting behind it. Oh, well, this is better than that one, right? Now, what that caused for me was a major issue, because I could feel my heart knowing the truth of there not being an inferiority superiority, like knowing that. And I could feel the internal battle that was created by the lens of inferiority superiority. But it was so close to my perception of it was like this fundamental thing inside me, like, well, more God realized is superior. Like, how could you question that? Less God realized is inferior. How could you question that? It was so close to my perspective that I couldn't even separate the two. And it created a major internal battle for me. And the battle was against inferiority in myself and for superiority, right? But under the disguise of for actualization and against, non-actualization. But it was an internal battle that becomes an external battle too. Battle of self-judgment, battle of judgment of others, right? Battle of inferiority and superiority feelings within myself. And it's not that those discernments were wrong, more actualized or less actualized. And I'm even calling it wrong. What was detrimental about that interpretation was the association of inferiority superiority put onto those two. So that it's a very sneaky lens, right? And it usually maps to our value systems. Like what we value, we see as superior, and what we don't value or condemn, we see as inferior. Now, what this, in the realm of actualization, because this is an interesting value structure to look at. Like actualization is, I think, a very useful, maybe the right word, very constructive value system to have, because it maps to our soul's essence, the natural soul progressive essence that we have, right? Our natural soul essence is reaching for greater actualization, right? And so it's valuable when our value systems align with that, but it doesn't make another value system inferior. It just makes it different, because things are what they are, and discernment's concerned with what is. So, but the interesting thing that that happens when the inferiority superiority is put on top of the lens of actualization is that the role of actualization gets completely distorted. So what is the value in discerning whether something is more actualized than another thing, more along on its evolutionary path than another thing? Well, the true value in that really is to help us to orient to our proper place within the teaching learning spectrum, or teacher learning, you could say, what is it, not correspondence, but reciprocation, right? If we don't have that discernment, then we don't know whether we're supposed to learn here or teach here. And teaching learning is the exchange that happens through humans that actually creates evolution. It's not the only thing, but it inspires evolution, the teaching learning dynamic between humans. And so the discernment of actualization is really important for that, because it helps us to find our place within that. And there's a dynamic exchange that happens. But in order for that dynamic exchange between teacher and student to happen, and realize teacher and student shifts context to context, so it's not like permanent teacher, permanent student, but a teacher fundamentally would be the one that is more actualized within whatever specific domain of concern, the agreed, perception and intention is going into, right? And then it may shift, where actualization shifts across different spectrums, right? But the teacher-student dynamic, in order for that to work properly, there needs to be a sacred reverence between the teacher and the student, and there needs to be a perception of equality of soul between the teacher and student. And from within that space, that's when the magic can really happen. When there's respect, when there's sacred reverence for the teacher you're learning from, and the teacher has sacred reverence for the student. When that's shared, tremendously powerful exchanges can happen, right? And it's beyond just intellectual. This is like osmosis kind of learning. Osmatic, maybe you would call it. I don't know how to use that word in the proper context. But a kind of transmission happens when that reverence is there that can't happen any other way. And so what's happened in this world and the way that we teach and learn is that there's this, this unspoken frame of superiority and inferiority put on top of it, which literally stunts the learning process. Because when no matter what side it is, if one person feels inferior, the other person feels superior, they can't meet each other for where they really are, and that exchange can't actually happen. So there's a lot of different, negative things that come from that. One is, if one is feeling inferior in a dynamic with a teacher or someone they're learning from, then they oftentimes will give their power away, right? And in giving their power away, if the other side is feeling superior, they'll often take advantage of the inferior one and, dominate in some way, or because they're the more actualized one and they deserve to be able to dominate. or take advantage in some way. Another thing that happens is the one that feels inferior may resist learning because they're afraid. They don't want to admit that they're inferior, which they aren't. But in that dynamic, they're feeling like, oh, well, since they're more actualized, that makes me inferior. I don't want to admit that I'm inferior, so I'm going to just resist the lesson altogether. There's nothing to learn. I'm going to try to discredit what the more actualized person is even saying, when there may be validity to what the more actualized person is saying, because they don't want to enter into the dynamic of inferiority, superiority, and feel like they're on the lower end of the totem pole. Conversely, the more actualized one may get all pompous about their own actualization and say, oh, it's not even worth teaching these, poor peasants. There's no way that they can understand this. I'm way more evolved than them. I'm never going to teach them that. And ironically, that kind of perspective, that kind of arrogant perspective of the more actualized, that's exactly the point when someone in their actualization process, they're becoming more actualized. The point that they become arrogant and think that they're better than others for being more actualized is the point at which they start regressing. They start moving backwards in actualization on a fundamental level, even if in some domains they may be more of an expert at certain things. It's like a soul regression that starts happening at that point. This is how Lucifer fell, right? Lucifer got this inferiority superiority lens came in. I am better, I am greater than the others, and I am going to and then he fell, right? Lucifer fell from that, right? So, it's kind of silly when you think about it, right? Because it's like saying that like a fruit is better than a seed, or fruit is superior to a seed. And it's like a fruit can't exist without a seed. Like a seed turns into a fruit. So how can it be superior? Well, contextually, a fruit that's ripe might have a contextual value that's more appropriate in a particular way for someone that is like hungry in the moment. Like a seed might not fill you up or satisfy your hunger in the same way that a fresh ripe fruit will. And so contextually, it has a particular value. But in another context, a seed can give you many, many fruits in the future when it's planted, right? So the seed has its own value too in a different context. And so to say that the fruit is more valuable than the seed, that's like saying that like a father is more, is better or superior to a son, or a mother is superior to a daughter. It doesn't make sense, right, really, when you think about it. But that's actually what we're doing, is we're putting that kind of distorted lens on top of reality when we think of, that who is more actualized, the guru or like the spiritual teacher or whatever. When we think of that as being superior, it's not better. It's just at a different point in time on the path of evolution. And this is where the whole thing really starts breaking down, is that, the evolutionary process isn't even linear. I'll get into that here in just a second. Now, the only place where we can really take inferiority, superiority into I wouldn't even say appropriate context, but is within a restricted context. And what I mean by that is that if you have a agreed upon value structure and you have a agreed upon isolated system context, I mean, you could maybe use the term superiority and inferiority, but in recognizing that is purely an ego perspective, because only an ego perspective can reduce itself so deeply like that and identify so hard with like a judgmental value structure. In other words, here's an example. I'll actually bring an example. So if you were to say within the limited context of scoring points, so points scored in a 20-minute time frame, if you put me and Michael Jordan in a one-on-one game, who scores most points, if whoever scores the most points is the superior, you could say, basketball player, then Michael Jordan is the superior basketball player. But do you see how restrictive I made that context in order for it to work? I had to restrict it down because from a universal perspective, what determines a good basketball player, right? Now, there's an agreed upon context that scoring points is, highly valuable within the value system of how people look at basketball, right? But in a universal context, if you're asking some, interdimensional or, metaphysical being on some higher level, what makes the better basketball player? Their answer could be, well, whichever player has the most love for the other players. So within that context, maybe the dynamic would shift, right? So, but within, a restricted context, you could maybe make a judgment of superiority or inferiority. But my point is that when we're making a judgment on something, that it's good or bad, or that it's inferior or superior, we're essentially putting a universal value judgment on something without even being able to have a big enough perspective of what universality really is. Like, we can't see from all different dimensions, from all different perspectives, to actually even be able to make a determination like one thing is fundamentally better than another thing. There's so much more to everything that that only the Godhead could even make that determination. And I would argue that, and this is where I think the saying "only God can judge me" comes from. Only God can judge me, because only God can really even make that judgment. But I would even go as far as to say, I don't believe that God makes judgments like that. I think God's interested in what is. And the reason why I say that is because God meets every being wherever they are. Everything, it meets it wherever it is. And if it was judging it as good or bad, if it had a charge against that, it wouldn't be able to meet it wherever it is. Now, beings can judge God. They can create blocks between them and God. And God will give them the free will to do that. But God's right there with it to meet what the person or the being or whatever it is. It's right there to meet that being. And in order to be right there with what is, it can't be putting a judgment in front. So so my perspective is that God doesn't actually judge. God isn't judgmental. Things are what they are, and they beget what they beget based off of the vibrations that they are perpetuating, right? So it just is what it is. So it's not that God is judgmentally condemning and then choosing in the way that a human would judge, condemn, and then choose the good to prevail. It's that when the good is within and the good is being vibrated, it naturally begets its own prevailing. I don't know if I said that right, but it prevails because it is of like nature with that which prevails. It is one in harmony with truth, and that truth prevails. So where this brings us to now is the question of navigation, because ultimately we're talking about maps. So how do we navigate then? And the old way of navigating, for me, and I think for many people, is evaluating the reality, creating maps of the reality, and then making a judgment on what is superior and what is inferior, what is better and what is worse, and then choosing what's better, right? And making decisions in that way. But that's an over-mentalization of the process, and that judgment fundamentally takes us away from what is. And fundamentally, in that taking us away from what is, if we can't meet the relations that we're face-to-face with, we can't fully meet and show up with those relations, then we don't know what we're actually dealing with. We can't see reality clearly. And if we can't see reality clearly, then how do we know how to respond in an authentic way to reality? Because judgment, coming from the frame of inferiority, superiority, that is stepping out of our authenticity. It's stepping out of authenticity. And so the navigation kind of mechanism, or strategy, you could say, would be being present to what our authentic response is based off of clear discernment, which requires us to meet whatever it is we're experiencing. So we can use labels to bring us into context. We let go of the labels and are fully present with what we're experiencing. When we're fully present, we can experience things as close as possible, or maybe actually as they are. And when we're experiencing things as they are, and there isn't a judgment that creates a charge within us, then we can feel our true soul's essence authentically wanting to express in a particular way. And that way then is the right way, we could say. So in this sense, good or bad or right or wrong can be mapped as good is that which is in alignment with your soul essence's true authentic expression or beingness. And that which is out of alignment could be seen as, bad. So like good or bad or right or wrong in that sense. But these aren't inferior or superior. This is what is in alignment with self or what isn't in alignment with self. What isn't in alignment with self isn't inferior. And this comes to the idea of like good and evil. Like good is not superior to evil, because you can't. That's like saying that that the rotten fruit is inferior to the fruit. So we have the seed, and then we have the rotten fruit and the fruit. Saying the rotten fruit, being like evil, isn't inferior to the fruit, and it can't be because it's part of the cycle. Like the rotten fruit is what creates the, it can be used as compost, right? And then it's what the seed is planted in. So if the seed needs it in order to grow, or it becomes what the seed could use in order to grow, how is it really inferior? It can't really be inferior in that sense. Or another way of thinking of it is like, you maybe heard that the new student would learn from the adept, and or the master, and then the master may learn from the evil person. And because there's certain things that there's certain initiations that happen when a master has to face evil. I mean, this is, when Christ was going through the resurrection process, he had to go down into the depths of hell and face all the demons, and the demons were trying to trick him into judging. This is from the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. It was that the demons were trying to entice him into judging them, because if he judged the demons, then he would, it would bind him. And so he had to, not judge them, right? And this is an initiation, right? So if there's a certain initiation that comes from needing to face evil, then there's a place for that evil, right? It has a teaching function in a sense. Now, oftentimes that teaching function might not necessarily be necessary, but it's at least the consequence or the collateral damage consequence. Evil can be the collateral damage consequence of what I believe other laws of reality are that are necessary, like free will, right? So free will is necessary to uphold. All of the distortions that come from free will aren't necessarily necessary, but their potential for them is necessary in order for free will to exist, and free will is necessary to exist in a sense. So you can say it like that. But there's a place for it. Whether it's necessary or not, there's a place for it. And that place, all things by Creator, I believe, are turned into the good, in the sense that they eventually align back with true nature. And so all those things have their place. And so evil has its teaching function, right? And so to call evil inferior, it's just the wrong lens to take, right? It is what it is. And you can meet evil if you can see it truly for what it is. And if you're seeing evil truly for what it is, and you're meeting it, and you're being fully authentic and meeting yourself with what you truly are, then your natural soul essence expression will oftentimes be an expression that may destroy evil. but not from a place of judgment and I need to destroy this evil, from a place of this is your natural soul essence, authentic expression, which is a very different place than coming from a place that separates you from things, judges, and then destroys in that kind of sense. But from meeting fully whatever it is you're experiencing with, meeting yourself fully in your authenticity, and letting that authenticity, surrendering to that authenticity. So this is the navigation. It's the surrendering to the authenticity of self. Not categorizing, judging, and then choosing in that sense. And this is, why they say that the God moves in mysterious ways, or the mystic moves in mysterious ways, because the authentic soul expression will always have the perfect, intuitive response for the greatest alignment, in greatest alignment. And that response, depending on the circumstance, can look completely unorthodox and completely not what would be expected of a divine being, depending on the circumstance. Because there's too many things to account for to actually be able to predict it. Novelty is always a factor when it comes to the mystical, because there's no limits on God, and there's no limits on God expression. It can express, and it will continue to infinitely express in a novel way. So, one last thing that I want to share is, and this is kind of a way of being able to understand how it's pretty impossible for the ego mind to conceive of actualization in an individual accurately. And this is these are just some examples of how the perception could confuse us if we're looking at it from a linear kind of perspective. And this is the idea that our evolutionary process is not necessarily linear. And so here's just some examples of that, right? And you may have come across some of these ideas, but this helps to kind of root in the idea that even perceiving, God actualized beings in an inferiority superiority lens is a distortion. And this is, if a being, for example, a very, very powerful, evolved being may take on an incarnation into a really, really distorted lineage. And they may grow up in a situation in which that light of the God within them has gotten buried on top of so much ancestral karma and trauma and sort of difficult things that compared to another being that didn't have that weight, when they're looking at them, they may seem very unconscious. But see, there's very little, oftentimes, awareness as to maybe how powerful that soul is, how evolved that soul is, and how much weight that soul has taken on to sift through and then cleanse and heal for the entire lineage. It might be healing an entire lineage of DNA, but at this point on the path, they look completely unawake and stuck. While as the more evolved being that's perceiving that and maybe putting a judgment on that being as being unconscious, maybe is taking the equivalent of basket weaving or something in the karmic kind of world school, and so it's easier for them to to shine the radiance of God through them in that moment. But this other being, when they cleanse and clear that, their radiance of God being actualization, will show for what it really is, because it's trying to shine through a really, really, really dark space at that point, and it has to grow to do that. And so we can't really decide, know really how, where a being is actually on their path just by observing them in the moment. You could think of God realization as being, it's like, you think of it as being in the center right here. This is God realization. And our paths as a soul, could be going like this, or could be even moving straight in, or zigzagging around. Now, the more evolved being might be on a path like this, where it's coming closer to God realization, but then it's actually, that's the path it's on, and it's going to move further away. It may just be at a point where it's really close, and this being may look way more evolved than this being that's out here. But this being that's out here might be coming actually straight in to it. But it may look as if, you know, one being is way ahead of the other, but it's not linear necessarily like that in that sense, right? And so, again, like Lucifer fell, right? How Lucifer was how close and then fell. So you never really know where something is or where it's going, and it's not necessarily a linear process. So we have to remember that. I've seen many times in different situations where I've been more actualized in a certain area than another person, and then I've seen them surpass me, and I've seen myself surpass other people. I've surpassed mentors in different areas, and so it's this fluctuating thing, you know, and all there really is right now. And so there is the availability for God realization in the now, but there's also the availability for the drifting from that in the now. And so no matter how evolved the being is, it can drift, right? It can go into a different direction. And so we just have to remember that, right? So it's not about superior, inferiority, being ahead or behind. It's about what is, and what is within me, and how do I surrender to what is coming through me, and how do I surrender to what it is that I'm relating with or experiencing. And that's the only way to come back to true authenticity, and that, I feel, is the navigation path, as opposed to the, you know, judgment and then deciding in a mentalized kind of way. So that's what I have for you today. It was a lot to unpack, but hopefully you can really take this in and let it go to work on you, and hopefully this can be a tool that can help bring us closer to a more coherent map of reality, and we can see how to let go or begin letting go of some of these inferiority, superiority, polar distortions that are blocking us from our own authenticity and blocking us from that dynamic exchange that is meant to happen through the interaction of people, which requires us to drop our judgments to fully meet the situation at hand and the person, you know, or the being that we're interfacing with. So thank you so much for tuning in. I got to tell you guys, I got music coming up. I got so much music. I have several, I got a bunch of songs I'm working on. 2 music videos that are finished I'm going to be dropping here soon. I'm just getting my website all together so that I can have, you know, the proper launch for all this stuff. So I'm going to have my website together, and I'm going to put out these music videos really soon. They're incredible, working with a Grammy award-winning producer that is really just bringing all of my music to the next level, and it feels so good to finally be able to work in such synergy. So I'm really excited for you guys to hear this. If you're interested in that, go ahead and send me a message. Get on my email list. You can do that through my website. You can get on my email list for the release of the album. That's patrickhayes.com. patrickhayes.com. If you guys are not on my Telegram group, you want to be on my Telegram group, go to Telegram, Patrick Hayes channel and Patrick Hayes Live. Those are the 2 different handles over on Telegram. And if you haven't donated to my music fund, but you really like my music, then please donate to my music fund. The GoFundMe is on my Telegram page, and it's also on my website. So go check that out and donate. And I am super stoked to share more artistic creations with you. So thanks so much for being a part of this, and sending you much love, and I will talk to you next time.